The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the downtown courthouse as Agent Maya stepped through the heavy wooden doors. She had been tracking this case for 3 weeks now, and today would determine whether justice could finally be served. Her dark pantsuit was professional but understated, and her badge remained hidden beneath her jacket. To anyone watching, she looked like just another visitor navigating the busy halls of justice. Maya made her way to courtroom 4B, where Judge Harrison presided over his morning session. The hallways buzzed with activity as lawyers wheeled their briefcases. Families whispered nervously on benches, and court officers maintained order. She had requested this meeting through proper channels, but something told her this wouldn't be as straightforward as her other cases. The courtroom itself was impressive in an old-fashioned way. Dark wood paneling reached halfway up the walls, and the judge's bench stood elevated like a throne overlooking the proceedings. Maya chose a seat in the back row, close enough to observe, but far enough to remain inconspicuous. She watched as Judge Harrison handled the morning's cases with what seemed like routine efficiency. At 62 years old, Judge Harrison had been on the bench for nearly 2 decades. His gray hair was perfectly combed, and his black robes gave him an air of authority that he clearly enjoyed. Maya noticed how his demeanor changed depending on who stood before him. With well-dressed attorneys, he was cordial and professional. With others, particularly those who looked like they couldn't afford expensive legal representation, his patience seemed thinner. The first case involved a young mother seeking custody of her children. The woman was clearly nervous, stumbling over her words as she tried to explain her situation. Judge Harrison's sighs were audible throughout the courtroom, and his eye-rolling didn't go unnoticed by those in attendance. Maya felt her jaw tighten as she watched the proceedings unfold. Next came an elderly man fighting an eviction notice. His English wasn't perfect, but his desperation was clear. Judge Harrison barely looked up from his papers as the man spoke, occasionally interrupting with sharp comments about wasting the court's time. Maya had seen enough courtrooms to know that every judge had their own style, but this felt different. This felt personal. When the bailiff called out the next matter, Maya knew it was time. She stood and walked toward the front of the courtroom, her footsteps echoing softly on the polished floor. The judge was shuffling through papers, apparently more interested in his paperwork than in acknowledging her presence. "Your Honor," Maya began, her voice clear and professional, "I need to discuss a matter of federal importance that requires the court's assistance." Judge Harrison didn't even look up initially. When he finally did raise his eyes, Maya could see the immediate judgment forming in his expression. His gaze traveled from her face down to her simple outfit and back up again, as if he was cataloging every detail and finding each one wanting. "What seems to be the problem now?" The way he said "now" made it sound like she was just another in a long line of people wasting his valuable time. His tone carried the weight of assumption, the kind that suggested he had already decided what kind of person she was and what kind of problem she might have. Maya maintained her composure, though she felt the familiar sting of being prejudged. "Your Honor, I represent a federal agency, and we need to coordinate with your court regarding a witness protection matter. The individual in question is scheduled to testify in a high-profile case next week." The judge let out a small laugh, the kind that wasn't meant to be funny but rather dismissive. "Miss, this is a serious courtroom, not a place for dramatics or fantasy stories. If you have a legitimate legal matter, I suggest you get yourself a proper attorney who can present your case appropriately." The words hit Maya like a physical blow, but her training had prepared her for moments like this. She took a deep breath and tried again, speaking slowly and clearly. "Your Honor, I understand there may be some confusion, but this is an official federal matter that requires immediate attention. The safety of a protected witness depends on our ability to coordinate security measures with local courts." Judge Harrison leaned back in his chair, and Maya could see amusement dancing in his eyes. It was the look of someone who thought they were dealing with a confused or delusional person. Around the courtroom, people began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked embarrassed for Maya, while others seemed to be enjoying the spectacle. "Young lady," the judge said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made Maya's skin crawl. "I don't know what television shows you've been watching lately, but this is reality. We deal with real legal matters here, not make-believe federal agent stories. The courtroom fell silent except for a few uncomfortable coughs. Maya could feel eyes on her from every direction. Some people looked sympathetic, others seemed curious about what would happen next, and a few appeared to be enjoying what they saw as entertainment. Judge Harrison wasn't finished. He gestured broadly toward the gallery as if addressing an audience rather than handling a legal matter. We get all kinds of people in here thinking they can waste the court's time with elaborate stories and wild claims. Next thing you know, she'll be telling us she works for the FBI or the Secret Service or some other important government agency. His comment drew a few nervous chuckles from the audience, which only seemed to encourage him. Maya noticed how some people looked away, clearly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, while others leaned forward as if watching a show. "Your Honor," Maya tried once more, her voice steady despite the humiliation she felt burning in her chest. "I'm asking for just a few minutes of your time to discuss this matter privately. The nature of the case requires discretion, and I believe a sidebar conversation would be appropriate." But Judge Harrison was clearly enjoying himself now. He shook his head with exaggerated disappointment, like a teacher dealing with a particularly difficult student. "Miss, unless you have proper documentation, legitimate legal standing, and a real reason to be in my courtroom, I strongly suggest you leave before I'm forced to hold you in contempt of court." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Maya could feel her heart beating faster, not from fear but from the injustice of the situation. She had spent years serving her country, protecting people who would never know her name, and facing dangers that most people couldn't imagine. Yet here she stood, being treated like a nuisance by a man who had made assumptions about her based on nothing more than her appearance. She looked around the courtroom one more time, taking in the faces of the spectators, the court reporter who had stopped typing to watch the drama unfold, and the bailiff who seemed uncertain about whether he should intervene. This was a moment that would define not just her case, but something much larger about justice, respect, and the way people in power treat those they perceive as powerless. Maya's hand moved slowly toward her jacket pocket. Her training had taught her patience, but it had also taught her when patience was no longer the right strategy. The time had come to show Judge Harrison exactly who he was dealing with, and she had a feeling this would be a lesson he would never forget. Maya stood perfectly still in front of the judge's bench, her years of training helping her maintain composure despite the burning embarrassment she felt. The courtroom had grown quieter, with people leaning forward in their seats to catch every word of what was becoming an uncomfortable spectacle. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, some filled with pity, others with curiosity, and a few with what appeared to be secondhand embarrassment. Judge Harrison seemed oblivious to the discomfort he was causing. In fact, he appeared to be gaining momentum, like a performer who had found his rhythm. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at Maya with what could only be described as condescending amusement. The power dynamic in the room was clear to everyone present, and he was clearly enjoying his position at the top of it. "Miss," he began again, his voice carrying the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "I've been sitting on this bench for 19 years. In that time, I've seen every kind of story, every type of excuse, and every variety of person who thinks they can come into my courtroom and waste valuable time with fairy tales." Maya took a slow breath, centering herself the way she had been taught during her federal training. She had faced armed suspects, hostile witnesses, and life-threatening situations, but somehow this public humiliation felt different. It cut deeper because it was so personal, so based on assumptions about who she was rather than what she had done. "Your Honor, I understand your skepticism," she replied, her voice remaining steady and professional. "However, I'm not here to tell stories. I'm here on official business that directly impacts the safety of a federal witness. Time is a critical factor in this matter." The judge let out another laugh, this one louder than before. He turned slightly toward the gallery, as if inviting them to share in his amusement. "Official business," he repeated, drawing out the words mockingly. "Young lady, do you have any idea how many people come through these doors claiming to be on official business? Just last week, I had someone insist they were working undercover for the mayor's office." A few people in the audience chuckled, nervously. Maya noticed an older woman in the third row shaking her head disapprovingly, while a man in a suit near the front was checking his phone, apparently uncomfortable with the entire situation. The court reporter had resumed typing, dutifully, recording every word of what was becoming an increasingly painful exchange. Maya tried a different approach. "Your Honor, perhaps we could discuss this matter in your chambers. The sensitive nature of the case requires discretion, and I believe a private conversation would be more appropriate for all parties involved." But Judge Harrison wasn't having any of it. He leaned back in his high-backed chair, his black robe spreading around him like wings. "Now you want to go to my chambers?" he asked with exaggerated surprise. "What's next? Are you going to tell me you have top-secret clearance? Maybe you're working directly with the president?" The sarcasm in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Maya felt her jaw tighten slightly, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had dealt with difficult people before, but rarely had she encountered someone so determined to humiliate her publicly. "Your Honor," she said, her voice taking on a slightly firmer tone. "I'm simply asking for a few minutes of your time to discuss a legitimate federal matter. I understand that my request may seem unusual, but I assure you that it's both urgent and authentic." Judge Harrison shook his head with theatrical disappointment. He picked up his gavel and tapped it gently on the wooden block, the sound echoing through the silent courtroom like a judge's hammer of condemnation. "Miss, I'm going to give you one more chance to explain yourself clearly, or I'm going to have to ask the bailiff to escort you out of my courtroom." The threat was clear, and Maya could see the bailiff shift slightly in his position near the side door. The man looked uncomfortable, as if he hoped he wouldn't have to get involved in whatever was happening. Maya noticed that his hand hadn't moved toward his radio or any restraints, suggesting that even he wasn't entirely convinced that she posed a threat. Around the courtroom, the tension was becoming palpable. The family members waiting for their own cases to be called were looking back and forth between Maya and the judge like spectators at a tennis match. A few lawyers who had been reviewing their notes were now paying full attention to the drama unfolding before them. Maya decided to make one final attempt at reasoning with the judge. "Your Honor, I represent a federal law enforcement agency. We have been working on a case that involves witness intimidation and threats against someone scheduled to testify in federal court next week. We need your court's cooperation to ensure proper security measures are in place." Judge Harrison's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. "A federal law enforcement agency?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Well, now we're getting somewhere. Which agency would that be? The FBI, the DEA? Or perhaps you're with the Secret Service?" The way he said Secret Service made it sound like the most ridiculous possibility in the world. Maya felt something shift inside her chest, a mixture of anger and determination that she had learned to harness during her years of service. She could see where this was heading, and she realized that the judge was about to get a lesson in assumptions. "Your Honor," she said, her voice becoming quieter but somehow more commanding, "I've tried to handle this matter with discretion and respect for your court. However, your continued dismissal of a legitimate federal matter is becoming problematic." Judge Harrison's face began to show the first signs of irritation. Up until now, he had been enjoying the exchange, but Maya's change in tone seemed to catch him off guard. "Problematic?" he repeated. "Young lady, the only problem I see here is someone wasting the court's time with elaborate fantasies." He gestured broadly toward the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly why we have procedures and protocols. Anyone can walk in here and claim to be working for the government. Next thing you know, she'll be showing us some fake badge she bought online or printed at home." The comment about a fake badge was the final straw. Maya had spent years earning her credentials, sacrificing time with family and friends to serve her country. She had undergone extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, and physical training that most people couldn't imagine. The suggestion that she would carry fake credentials was not just insulting, it was deeply personal. "Your Honor," she said, her voice now carrying a steel edge that made several people in the courtroom sit up straighter, "I think you're about to discover that your assumptions about me are not only wrong, but potentially embarrassing for everyone involved." Judge Harrison leaned forward, his amusement now mixed with genuine annoyance. "Are you threatening me, miss?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "Because if you are, I can assure you that contempt of court charges are very real, and I have no hesitation about using them." Maya smiled for the first time since entering the courtroom, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who knew something that others didn't. The smile of someone who was about to turn the tables in a very dramatic way. "Not a threat, Your Honor," she said calmly. "Just a statement of fact. You've made several assumptions about me today, and I think it's time to clear up any confusion about exactly who you're dealing with." The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to quiet down, as if the building itself was holding its breath for what would come next. The silence in the courtroom was so complete that Maya could hear her own heartbeat. Every person in the room seemed frozen in place, waiting to see what would happen next. Judge Harrison sat behind his bench with a mixture of annoyance and curiosity, on his face, clearly expecting her to back down or leave quietly. He had no idea that he was about to experience one of the most humbling moments of his career. Maya's hand moved slowly toward her jacket, her movements deliberate and controlled. Years of training had taught her that every gesture mattered, especially in moments of high tension. She could feel the weight of her credentials in her inner pocket, the same credentials that had opened doors across the country and commanded respect from officials at every level of government. The bailiff noticed her movement and tensed slightly, his hand moving closer to his radio. Maya caught his eye and gave him a small, reassuring nod. She understood his caution, but she also knew that what was about to happen would change the entire atmosphere in the room. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying a new authority that hadn't been there before. "You've spent the last several minutes making assumptions about who I am and why I'm here. You've suggested that I'm wasting your time, that I'm telling fantasy stories, and that any credentials I might have are fake." Judge Harrison shifted in his chair, perhaps beginning to sense that something was different about Maya's demeanor. The mockery in his expression was starting to fade, replaced by a wariness that suggested he might finally be paying attention. Maya continued, her voice steady and clear. "You've done this in front of a courtroom full of people, making jokes at my expense and treating me like some kind of nuisance that wandered in off the street. You've questioned my honesty, my professionalism, and my right to be here." Around the courtroom, people were sitting up straighter. The family members waiting for their cases had stopped whispering among themselves. The lawyers had put down their papers. Even the court reporter had slowed her typing, as if she sensed that whatever was about to happen needed to be recorded with special care. "Your Honor," Maya said, her hand now reaching into her jacket, "I think it's time we cleared up any confusion about exactly who you've been talking to." The gold badge emerged from her jacket like a sunrise, catching the fluorescent lights and throwing small reflections across the courtroom walls. The official seal of the United States Secret Service gleamed unmistakably, its eagle and shield design recognized by anyone who had ever seen it on television or in movies. But this wasn't a prop or a replica. This was the real thing, carried by someone who had earned the right to wear it. "I am Special Agent Maya Johnson with the United States Secret Service," she announced, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "I have been trying for the past 15 minutes to discuss an official federal matter that requires your court's cooperation." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Judge Harrison's face went through a series of changes that would have been almost funny under different circumstances. First came confusion, as if he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. Then came recognition, as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Finally came something that looked very much like panic. The badge itself was impressive in its simplicity. Unlike the flashy props often seen in movies, this was a working federal agent's credential, worn smooth in places from years of use. The identification card that accompanied it bore Maya's photograph and official information, along with security features that made it impossible to fake. Judge Harrison leaned forward in his chair, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. He squinted at the badge and ID card, as if hoping that closer examination might reveal them to be clever forgeries. but the harsh courtroom lighting only made their authenticity more obvious. Around the courtroom, the reaction was a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and fascination. The older woman in the third row covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with disbelief. A young man near the back pulled out his phone and then seemed to think better of it, putting it away quickly. The lawyers in the front rows exchanged glances that spoke volumes about what they had just witnessed. The bailiff relaxed visibly, his hand moving away from his radio. As someone who worked in law enforcement himself, he recognized authentic, federal credentials when he saw them. His expression had changed from wariness to something approaching sympathy for the judge, who was clearly realizing the magnitude of his mistake. Maya held her credentials steady, giving everyone in the room time to see them clearly. She wasn't showing off or trying to intimidate anyone. She was simply establishing the truth after 15 minutes of being called a liar and a fantasist. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice now carrying the authority that came with her position, "I've been attempting to discuss a witness protection matter that directly impacts national security. The individual we're protecting has received credible threats, and we need to coordinate security arrangements for their testimony in federal court next week." Judge Harrison's mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Agent Johnson, I had no way of knowing." Maya's expression remained professional, but there was steel in her voice when she responded. "Your Honor, with respect, you had no way of knowing because you chose not to listen. I identified myself as representing a federal agency multiple times. I requested a private meeting to discuss sensitive matters. I explained that this involved witness protection and national security." The judge's face had gone from its normal color to something approaching gray. Sweat was beginning to form on his forehead despite the air conditioning in the courtroom. He was clearly beginning to understand not just the mistake he had made, but the potential consequences of that mistake. "I asked for discretion because these matters are sensitive," Maya continued. "Instead, you chose to mock me publicly, question my honesty, and threaten me with contempt of court. You did this based on assumptions about who I am and what I represent." Around the courtroom, people were beginning to shift uncomfortably in their seats. What had started as entertainment was now becoming deeply embarrassing for everyone involved. The family members who had been waiting for their cases were looking down at their hands, clearly wishing they were anywhere else. Maya slowly returned her credentials to her jacket pocket, the movement as deliberate as when she had removed them. "Your Honor, I'm still here on official business. We still need to discuss the security arrangements for our protected witness. The difference is that now we both understand exactly who we're dealing with." Judge Harrison cleared his throat several times, trying to regain some composure. His hands were visibly shaking as he reached for his water glass, taking a long drink before attempting to speak again. "Agent Johnson," he said, his voice still unsteady, Perhaps we could continue this discussion in my chambers." Maya nodded curtly. "That would be appropriate, Your Honor, as I suggested 15 minutes ago." The reminder hung in the air like smoke, a gentle but unmistakable acknowledgement of how this entire situation could have been avoided. The courtroom remained silent as the implications of what had just happened began to sink in. A federal agent had been publicly humiliated by a sitting judge, who had made assumptions based on appearance rather than listening to what she was actually saying. It was the kind of moment that would be remembered and talked about for years to come. The walk to Judge Harrison's chambers felt like the longest journey of his life. His legs felt unsteady beneath his black robes, and his mind raced with the implications of what had just happened. Behind him, Agent Maya Johnson walked with the quiet confidence of someone who had regained control of the situation. The courtroom they left behind buzzed with whispered conversations as people tried to process what they had witnessed. Judge Harrison's chambers were a reflection of his 19 years on the bench. Law books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather spines creating a mosaic of legal knowledge. His mahogany desk was covered with case files, legal briefs, and the remnants of his morning coffee. Family photos sat in silver frames, showing happier moments with his wife and grandchildren. None of these familiar surroundings brought him comfort now. He closed the door behind them with trembling hands, the solid oak providing a barrier between them and the curious eyes in the courtroom. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Judge Harrison struggled to find words that could somehow undo the damage he had caused. Maya stood near the window, looking out at the city streets below. Police cars moved through traffic, their officers going about their daily duties of protecting and serving. She thought about her own colleagues who were at this very moment working cases across the country, putting their lives on the line for people who would never know their names. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had been treated with less respect in a courthouse than she received from criminals she had arrested. Agent Johnson, Judge Harrison finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you the most sincere apology. What happened out there was completely inappropriate and unprofessional." Maya turned from the window, her expression calm but her eyes still holding the steel that had emerged during their public confrontation. She had heard apologies before, from suspects who got caught, from officials who realized their mistakes, too late, from people who were sorry they had been exposed rather than sorry for what they had done. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice measured and professional. "An apology is a start, but I need you to understand that what happened out there wasn't just inappropriate. It was a clear example of bias and prejudice affecting the administration of justice." Judge Harrison sank into his leather chair, the weight of her words hitting him like physical blows. He had spent nearly 2 decades believing he was fair and impartial, taking pride in his ability to see through deception and get to the truth. Now he was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that his own assumptions had blinded him to the truth, standing right in front of him. "I want you to think about this," Maya continued, moving away from the window to face him directly. "For 15 minutes, you made assumptions about who I was based solely on my appearance. You didn't listen to what I was saying. You didn't consider that I might be telling the truth. Instead, you chose to humiliate me publicly because you had already decided what kind of person I was." The judge's hand shook as he reached for a tissue to wipe the sweat from his forehead. His comfortable world of absolute authority had been shattered, replaced by the harsh reality of his own prejudices. "Agent Johnson, I don't know what to say. I've never thought of myself as someone who would what?" Maya interrupted, gently but firmly. "Judge people by their appearance? Make assumptions based on race and gender? Refuse to listen when someone is trying to tell you something important?" Each question hit its mark. Judge Harrison had built his career on the belief that he was above such things, that his position and experience made him immune to the kind of bias that affected other people. The realization that he was not only capable of such behavior but had just displayed it publicly was devastating. Maya walked over to one of his law books and pulled out a volume on constitutional law. "Your Honor, every day you sit on that bench and make decisions that affect people's lives. You have the power to separate families, send people to prison, and determine whether justice is served. That power comes with tremendous responsibility." She opened the book to a section on equal protection under the law, the pages worn from years of reference. "When you treat people differently based on assumptions rather than facts, you're not just being rude. You're undermining the very foundation of our legal system." Judge Harrison looked at the book in her hands, recognizing it as one he had consulted countless times over the years. The words on those pages had guided his decisions in hundreds of cases, yet somehow he had forgotten their most basic principle when it mattered most. "I need you to understand something else," Maya continued, closing the book and setting it on his desk. "I'm not the first person you've treated this way, and if nothing changes, I won't be the last. How many other people have stood in your courtroom and been dismissed because they didn't look like what you expected?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Judge Harrison thought back over the years, remembering cases where he had been impatient with certain defendants, situations where he had made quick judgments about people's credibility based on their appearance or manner of speaking. The memories were uncomfortable, but they were also undeniable. "What happened today?" Maya said, her voice taking on a more authoritative tone, "cannot happen again, not just for my sake, but for the sake of every person who will stand before your bench expecting fair treatment and equal justice." Judge Harrison nodded weakly, finally beginning to understand the full scope of what he had done. This wasn't just about one embarrassing moment or one federal agent he had mistreated. This was about a pattern of behavior that had been invisible to him but obvious to everyone else. "Agent Johnson," he said, his voice stronger now as he tried to regain some measure of dignity. "You're absolutely right. What happened today was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for it. But please help me understand how to make this right." Maya studied his face, looking for signs of genuine remorse versus mere damage control. She had dealt with enough people in crisis to recognize the difference between someone who was sorry they got caught and someone who was truly sorry for what they had done. "Your Honor," she said finally, "making this right isn't going to be easy or quick. It's going to require you to examine not just what happened today, but how you've been conducting yourself on the bench for years. It's going to mean acknowledging that your position of power doesn't make you immune to bias." She moved toward the door, her hand on the handle before turning back to face him one final time. "And it's going to mean making changes that ensure no one else has to go through what I experienced today. Because if a federal agent can be treated with such disrespect in your courtroom, imagine how you've been treating ordinary citizens who don't have badges to prove their worth." Judge Harrison sat alone in his chambers after she left, surrounded by his law books and legal precedents, finally understanding that true justice required more than knowledge of the law. It required the wisdom to see people as they truly were, not as assumptions and prejudices suggested they might be. The weight of that realization would stay with him for the rest of his career. 3 weeks had passed since the incident in Judge Harrison's courtroom, but the effects were still rippling through the legal community like stones thrown into still water. Maya sat in her downtown office, reviewing the final security reports for the witness protection case that had brought her to the courthouse that day. The federal trial had concluded successfully, with their protected witness testifying safely and the defendants receiving appropriate sentences. But the real story wasn't about the case she had solved. It was about the change she had sparked. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her supervisor at the Secret Service. "Have you seen the local news today?" it read, followed by a link to a story about courthouse reforms. Maya clicked on the link and found herself reading about new training programs being implemented across the state's court system. The article mentioned recent incidents that had highlighted the need for better cultural awareness among judicial staff. Maya smiled slightly as she read. She knew that recent incidents was a polite way of referring to what had happened with Judge Harrison. Word had spread quickly through legal circles, not because Maya had spoken about it publicly, but because too many people had witnessed it firsthand. In a world where lawyers, court reporters, and bailiffs talked to each other across different courtrooms, secrets like this didn't stay secret for long. The phone on her desk rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Agent Johnson, this is Patricia Williams from the State Bar Association. I hope you have a few minutes to talk." Maya recognized the name. Patricia was the head of the Ethics Committee, someone whose opinion carried significant weight in legal circles. "Of course," Maya replied, settling back in her chair. "How can I help you?" "Well," Patricia said, her voice carrying a mixture of embarrassment and determination, "I'm calling because we've received some concerning reports about judicial conduct and your name has come up as someone who might have insights into what happened." Maya chose her words carefully. She had no interest in destroying Judge Harrison's career, but she also couldn't ignore the broader implications of what had occurred. "I can tell you that I've had experiences in certain courtrooms that highlighted the importance of treating all citizens with equal respect, regardless of their appearance." Patricia was quiet for a moment before responding. "Agent Johnson, I want you to know that the Bar Association takes these matters very seriously. We're implementing new mandatory training programs for all judges and court personnel. We're also establishing clearer protocols for handling federal matters and improving communication between different levels of law enforcement." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Patricia asking thoughtful questions about courthouse procedures and the challenges faced by federal agents working with local courts. Maya found herself impressed by the woman's genuine commitment to meaningful change rather than just damage control. After hanging up, Maya walked to her office window and looked down at the busy street below. She could see the courthouse in the distance, its impressive architecture standing as a symbol of justice and fairness. She wondered how many other people had walked through those doors hoping for fair treatment, only to be judged by their appearance rather than their character or circumstances. Her computer chimed with an email notification. The sender was Judge Harrison himself. Maya hesitated before opening it, unsure what to expect. When she finally clicked on the message, she found a formal, carefully written letter that went far beyond a simple apology. "Dear Agent Johnson," it began, "I have spent the past 3 weeks reflecting on my behavior in my courtroom, and I am writing to inform you of the steps I am taking to ensure that such an incident never happens again." The letter went on to detail his enrollment in cultural sensitivity training, his commitment to reviewing past cases for signs of bias, and his work with the courthouse administration to establish better procedures for handling federal matters. But what struck Maya most was the personal nature of his reflection. "I have realized that my position of authority had made me comfortable with making quick judgments about people," he wrote. "I convinced myself that my experience gave me the ability to assess someone's credibility within moments of meeting them. What I failed to understand was that this ability was actually a collection of unconscious biases that I had never properly examined." Maya found herself nodding as she read. This wasn't the defensive response of someone trying to protect their reputation. This was the genuine reflection of someone who had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. The letter continued, "I want you to know that I have begun reaching out to attorneys and community leaders to better understand how my courtroom practices may have affected others. The feedback has been difficult to hear, but necessary for me to become the judge I should have been all along." Maya appreciated his honesty, but she also knew that real change would take time to prove itself. She had seen too many people make promises in the heat of embarrassment, only to return to old patterns once the attention died down. Her phone rang again, this time with a call from Detective Rodriguez from the local police department. "Agent Johnson, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. I wanted to talk to you about some changes we're seeing in how federal and local law enforcement interact." Maya had worked with Detective Rodriguez on several cases over the years and respected his professionalism. "What kind of changes?" she asked. "Well," he said, "we've been getting new training about recognizing federal credentials and procedures for coordinating with federal agents. Apparently, there was some kind of incident that highlighted gaps in our knowledge. I wanted to make sure our department is properly prepared for future joint operations." Maya realized that the ripple effects of her encounter with Judge Harrison were reaching even further than she had imagined. Local police departments were updating their training, court personnel were learning new protocols, and the entire system was being forced to examine how it treated people who didn't fit certain expectations. Over the following months, Maya began to hear stories from other federal agents about improved reception in local courts. She received thank you notes from defense attorneys whose clients had been treated with more respect. Most importantly, she heard from ordinary citizens who felt that the atmosphere in Judge Harrison's courtroom had become more welcoming and fair. The witness protection case that had started it all became a footnote to the larger story. Maya had successfully done her job, protecting someone who needed protection and ensuring that justice was served. But in the process, she had also accomplished something unexpected. She had forced an entire system to look in the mirror and acknowledge its flaws. 6 months after the incident, Maya received an invitation to speak at a conference for federal agents about working with local court systems. As she prepared her remarks, she thought about the lessons learned from that difficult day in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The real victory wasn't in embarrassing a judge or proving a point about respect. The real victory was in the knowledge that other people, federal agents, defendants, witnesses, and ordinary citizens, would be treated with more dignity because someone had been willing to stand up and demand better. Maya's experience had become a catalyst for change, proving that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons or warrants, but with courage, dignity, and the simple insistence that all people deserve to be treated with respect. The incident had ended with an uncomfortable revelation, but its lasting impact would be measured in the countless interactions that would be handled better because people had learned to look beyond their assumptions and see the person standing before them.